Baggage fees and seat upgrades helped WestJet's latest earnings top expectations from analysts. So-called ancillary revenue jumped 15%. That revenue includes cancellation fees, in-flight purchases, and charges for picking your seat location. How far can the airlines go when it comes to extra fees? Gábor Lukács is founder of Air Passenger Right. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's just start with the fees themselves. I mean, we all will remember there was a time when airlines just charged one fee. It was called your ticket price. And then at some point, they broke out this so-called fuel surcharge as fuel costs got away from them. And that was the beginning of this kind of, the thin edge of the wedge. So I got to ask, when you see these numbers, do you feel as though it's sort of endless, that eventually the ticket will represent just some sort of weird entry fee and then everything else is extra?
Under the law, passengers do have the right to know how much they are going to pay. So there are laws, regulations governing how prices are advertised, and they have to advertise a total price. By breaking out various extra services, which the airlines claim to be extra services, they are making the expense more palatable, but more difficult for the passengers to know what the bottom line is.
How much of this is pure psychology, that we like the number we see, even though we know in the end it's going to be a different number? We may pay some of those fees later after the fact. Does that help us stomach the fees better in some way?
I don't have research to support the psychological effect. Certainly, it does come across as some form of cash grab from a subjective perspective, because you expect when you go into restaurants to pay for your meal. You don't expect to pay separately for using the salt, the pepper, the fork, and the knife, and your meal.
Or even the seat and the table. So when we talk about the Passenger Bill of Rights, how did these fees fit into that picture?
The government's proposed regulations are going to harm passengers in a number of ways. They're going to make things worse when it comes to the time the airline can keep you on the tarmac, or actually getting compensation for when you are bumped from a flight or you're delayed or canceled. The Canadian regulations is nothing comparable to the European gold standard of passenger rights. These issues are not governed by the regulations at all, actually.
What do you mean by that?
The regulations are silent as to what or how the airline can charge in terms of these baggage fees or cancellation fees. And when you look at all the other aspects of what happens when the airline cancels the flight, or you cancel the flight, or the airline delays you, in the vast majority of the cases, passengers will get no compensation because the conditions are so strict that the airline will be able to make up some excuse and not pay you.
So has there been, obviously, you among others will have suggested that we should go closer to the European model. What's the response from the Canadian government on that?
The Canadian government has no interest in listening to the public and listening to the passengers. They have agreed with the airlines what those regulations should be, and that is what they are doing. We know that before any public consultation took place, more than a year almost before a public consultation took place, the airlines and the government have already had some private discussions on what should be in the regulations. So what we have here are regulations written by the airlines for the airlines.
And to your point, we do have a model that we could look at. It presumably is a more expensive one, maybe a less predictable one. What are some of the arguments on the side of the airlines that they can't pay more, for instance, for a canceled flight or a delay?
It's not even a question of how much they pay. It's more a question of when they pay. The amounts in the Canadian proposal look on its face good on the paper. But, for example, for a flight that you are bumped from, in Europe, there's only one question. Were you at the airport? Were you available for check-in? If yes, and the airline doesn't take you, you get compensation. In Canada, however, you as the passenger will have to prove also that the flight was overbooked, that the reason they didn't let you on the flight is not because they were understaffed or not something else, but actually that the flight itself didn't have enough seats, which is virtually impossible to prove unless you have access to the airline's reservation system.
Which must be obvious to anybody. It's just logical. You couldn't actually prove that without their help. So is that just designed so that you can never claim compensation if it is overbooked, which they do all the time, as I understand it?
It is designed in such a way that the airlines won't have to pay in a vast majority of the cases unless they voluntarily admit that the flight was overbooked. With cancellation delays, it's even worse because the airline can claim that the delay or cancellation was due to maintenance issues, and then they don't have to pay you anything. In Europe, if they claim maintenance, they still have to pay you. In Europe, the only time when they can avoid paying compensation is if it is something completely extraordinary, like a snowstorm, like a terrorist attack, something which has nothing to do with the normal operation of the airline. In Europe, they know for many years that the day-to-day operation of the airline and maintenance of aircraft is part of the normal business. So the same way that we cannot tell the airline which aircraft to buy, it is their responsibility. It is their responsibility to maintain their fleet.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Great to have your thoughts on this, Gábor.